So, let me tell you a wild story. It all started back in 1602 in a little village called Trent, which is now part of Slovakia. There were these strange rumors floating around of young women who had come to the area, looking for work as servants, were mysteriously disappearing. Naturally, people started whispering and pointing fingers, and the suspicion quickly fell on one of the most infamous figures in history, Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Now, Elizabeth Bathory's name has been linked to some pretty dark stuff. In fact, she's often called the most brutal female serial killer of all time. But here's where it gets interesting. Over the centuries, her story has become this twisted blend of fact and myth. Some people claim she was a vampire with magical powers, while others think that powerful men made up these horrifying tales just to discredit her and get their hands on her wealth. It's kind of like a historical mystery that still doesn't have a clear answer. Let me backtrack a little and tell you about her beginnings. Elizabeth was born on August 7, 1560, into the Bathory family, which had some serious issues with inbreeding. A lot of her relatives had mental health problems, or even genetic disorders. Her own uncle, King Stephen Bathory, had epileptic seizures, and her two brothers were known for being tyrants and criminals. To top it all off, her father was a bit eccentric. There's a story about him riding a sleigh around in the summer. Elizabeth's early life is a bit of a mystery, but one thing is clear: she was a force to be reckoned with. She was incredibly beautiful, with jet black hair and a flawless complexion. But beyond her looks, she was super smart. She was fluent in multiple languages like Hungarian, Slovak, Greek, Latin, and German, which was pretty rare for a woman back then. However, her childhood wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. She had some serious health issues. Epileptic seizures, mood swings, and these awful migraines started when she was just a little girl, around 4 or 5 years old. Now, if you think things couldn't get worse, hold on. In the 16th century, peasants were basically treated like property, so they were often abused, and Elizabeth got an up-close look at that brutality. One of the most shocking moments from her childhood was when she saw a public execution in 1566. A gypsy man, accused of kidnapping children and selling them into slavery, was sewn into the stomach of a horse as punishment. Dark, right? And then, when Elizabeth was about 15, her cousin Stephen Bathory went off the rails. He led a violent rebellion, and in one of his rages he ordered the mutilation of local peasants, cutting off their ears and noses. That's the kind of environment Elizabeth grew up in, and who knows what effect that had on her as she got older. So here's where things take an even stranger turn. When Elizabeth was just 10 years old, she was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian nobleman who was 5 years older than her. Ferenc came from a powerful family, the Dragafis, and was set to inherit a lot of land and wealth. Their engagement wasn't formalized until 3 years later, but when they finally tied the knot in 1575, it was quite the event. The wedding was held at a grand castle in Vranov nad Toplu, and the celebrations lasted 3 whole days. Imagine that, 3 days of feasts, dancing, and royal festivities. After the wedding, Elizabeth moved in with Ferenc, but not to a regular home. She settled into his family's castle in Sarvar, where she had to adjust to the duties of a noblewoman. As was customary back then, Elizabeth was sent to live with Ferenc's mother to learn how to manage a noble household. But here's where things get interesting. As part of her dowry, Elizabeth received Countess Castle, a huge Gothic fortress that sat in the isolated backwoods of Upper Hungary. It was a key piece of land, and it came with a bunch of surrounding villages, so Elizabeth now had some serious power. Now, this marriage wasn't just about love or status. It was a political move, bringing together two of Hungary's most influential families. The Bathorys, as you might already know, had a pretty wild reputation. Mental illness, eccentricities, and scandals followed them around. On the flip side, the Nadasdys were the complete opposite. They were respected for their piety, stability, and old-school conservative values. It's almost like a clash of two worlds, right? But things weren't all smooth sailing for Elizabeth. Ferenc was frequently away at war, leaving her to manage everything on her own. And she didn't just take care of the estate. She also settled local disputes and became a mentor to young noblewomen who were sent to her for education. In the middle of all this responsibility, whispers began to spread. Rumors claimed that Elizabeth had secretly given birth to an illegitimate child in 1574, fathered by a local peasant named Laszlo Bende. The story goes that Laszlo was accused of rape, and when Ferenc found out about the affair, he allegedly had him castrated. To keep the whole thing quiet, Elizabeth supposedly delivered the baby in secret and had the child sent far away to Wallachia, under strict orders never to return to Transylvania as long as Elizabeth was alive. It turns out Ferenc, Elizabeth's husband, wasn't just cruel on the battlefield. He had a pretty dark side at home, too. One of the most chilling stories about him involves a young servant girl. Apparently, he ordered her to be covered in honey and tied outside, where she was left to be tortured by swarms of insects. But it doesn't stop there. Ferenc seemed to have a special knack for teaching Elizabeth his own cruel methods. He showed her how to punish servants using something he called kicking the stars. This method involved lighting oil-soaked paper between a servant's fingers, which would burn them terribly. And if that wasn't twisted enough, he even gave Elizabeth a pair of gloves with sharp metal claws, supposedly to help her carry out her discipline with terrifying efficiency. Despite all the cruelty around her, Elizabeth wasn't just a passive observer. She took charge of the household and managed her estates with impressive diligence, traveling between castles to keep everything running smoothly. But here's where things get even darker. With Ferenc often away for long periods on military campaigns, Elizabeth had a lot of freedom to do as she pleased. And let's just say she didn't exactly spend her time on good works. During her travels, Elizabeth would visit relatives like her Aunt Clara in Vienna. Clara was famous for hosting wild gatherings that were full of excess and debauchery. Rumor had it that these parties included romantic relationships between women, which was way beyond what society would normally tolerate. Under her aunt's influence, Elizabeth started exploring a whole new world of forbidden pleasures and power dynamics. But things took an even stranger turn when she became involved with the occult. It was through Clara's servant, a man named Thorko, that Elizabeth was introduced to mysticism, rituals, and spells. Thorko supposedly taught her all sorts of magical practices, claiming that they could help her control her fate, protect her estates, and even get revenge on those who wronged her. Elizabeth became fascinated by these ideas and began inviting various self-proclaimed witches, alchemists, and fortune-tellers to her court. These people promised her all kinds of supernatural power, feeding into her growing obsession. But the real rumors started swirling when Elizabeth began associating with a mysterious man who was said to have an eerie presence. Locals described him as pale, sharp-toothed, and always dressed in black. The villagers were terrified, whispering that Elizabeth had somehow become involved with vampires. As the rumors spread, Elizabeth earned a chilling new nickname, the Beast of Countess. It's no wonder her story has become this wild mix of fact, myth, and superstition. Between her husband's cruelty, her own dark explorations, and the supernatural rumors surrounding her, Elizabeth Bathory's life became a perfect storm of mystery and fear. Elizabeth's interest in the occult was not merely ceremonial. She developed a hands-on approach to concocting potions and remedies, often blending practical medicine with arcane rituals. She claimed to have mastered spells and techniques that could harm her enemies. In one chilling letter to Ferenc, she outlined a method for casting curses, describing the ritualistic slaughter of a black hen with a white cane and the use of its blood to curse a target. Whether such spells were symbolic or carried out as actual practices remains a matter of speculation, but they added to her growing mystique. As Elizabeth's obsession with control and pain deepened, she began to act out her darker impulses on those closest to her. Starting around 1585 at Sarvar Castle, she began punishing servants for minor mistakes or imagined offenses. Her belief that the screams of her victims could alleviate her debilitating migraines offered her a grim justification for her actions. The punishments she inflicted were cruel and inventive, designed to maximize suffering. In her early years of cruelty, she would drive needles beneath the fingernails of her victims, sever fingers, or lash them with nettles to inflame their skin. On freezing nights, she would strip girls naked, pour cold water over their bodies, and leave them to succumb to hypothermia outdoors. These acts were just the beginning of her descent into sadism. As time passed, Elizabeth's methods grew more barbaric and ritualistic. She began using red-hot pliers to tear flesh from her victims, branding their skin with heated irons, or using knives and blades to carve grotesque wounds. One particularly gruesome method involved stretching a victim's mouth so violently that the corners would tear completely, leaving them mutilated. Elizabeth's desire to control and torment seemed insatiable, and her household became a place of terror. Despite the horrors she inflicted, Elizabeth maintained a veneer of nobility and control in public. She continued to manage her vast estates, oversee her household, and engage with Hungarian high society. However, stories of her brutality began to circulate. The local villagers, already wary of her association with the occult, began to see her as a monstrous figure capable of inhuman acts. They feared her not only as a noble with unchecked power, but also as a woman steeped in dark forces they could neither understand nor challenge. Elizabeth's acts of cruelty, combined with her enigmatic and commanding personality, gradually cemented her legacy as the infamous Blood Countess. Her actions reflected a dangerous combination of privilege, unchecked authority, psychological torment, and a twisted sense of curiosity. This combination allowed her to experiment with suffering on a scale that would eventually become legendary, leaving a trail of pain and fear that would echo through history. A woman named Anna Darvulia enters the life of Countess Elizabeth Bathory. To the locals, Darvulia was no ordinary woman. They spoke of her in fearful whispers, calling her a wild beast in a woman's body, and some even believed she was a witch. From the moment she arrived at the castle, something sinister seemed to take hold of Elizabeth. The servants would later recall, in hushed tones, that mistress became crueler. With Darvulia's guidance, Elizabeth descended further into unimaginable cruelty. It was said that Darvulia taught her how to kill. At first, the deaths were cloaked in deception. Elizabeth claimed that a cholera epidemic had struck her estate, and she ensured that the funerals appeared dignified, complete with priests offering prayers and choirs singing hymns. The villagers, still reeling from the losses, never questioned the official story. But as the bodies of young servants piled up, the clergy began to grow suspicious. Too many deaths, all blamed on cholera or other mysterious causes, couldn't be explained away. By 1602, the situation had become untenable. A brave priest and scholar named István Magyari decided he could no longer stay silent. He publicly demanded that the bodies be exhumed, calling for an investigation into the deaths, and implored Elizabeth's husband, Count Ferenc Nadasdy, to intervene. But Ferenc, who had long been away on military campaigns, remained out of the picture. Little did he know, though, he wouldn't live to witness the full extent of his wife's depravity. On January 4, 1604, Ferenc passed away from injuries sustained in battle, or so the story went. But the rumors, of course, didn't stop there. Whispers began to spread that Elizabeth, or someone close to her, may have had a hand in his sudden and untimely death, setting off an even darker chain of events. Not long after her husband's demise, Elizabeth relocated to Chakticha. There, she moved into a stronghold near the local church, and it was during this time that the horrors associated with her name escalated. The number of victims began to rise, and the Countess's thirst for blood grew insatiable. Her fury seemed to burn brightest when preparing for public appearances or embarking on journeys. Her methods became increasingly grotesque. Elizabeth was said to attack her victims with her teeth, tearing into their necks, arms, and cheeks as though she were a wild animal. But her savagery didn't end there. She used razors to flay flesh, torches to burn, and tongs to maim. Seamstresses, who displeased her by crafting garments she didn't favor, were punished in the cruelest manner imaginable. She sewed their mouths shut. The name Blood Countess would become synonymous with these atrocities, and her legacy would linger as one of history's darkest tales. Within the grim walls of her castle, Elizabeth Bathory commanded a retinue of loyal yet terrifying servants. Among them were individuals as twisted as the deeds they carried out in her name. There was Jan Ujvari, known as Fichko, an ugly dwarf whose small stature belied his cruel heart. Anna Darvulia, a trusted confidant and sinister mentor, had begun to fade from the Countess's inner circle after blindness claimed her. In her place came others. Each of these accomplices brought their own methods of torment to the Countess's twisted court. Dorka had a penchant for cutting off her victims' fingers with scissors, relishing the sharp snap of metal through flesh. Darvulia preferred the brutal simplicity of a whip, delivering 500 lashes with methodical cruelty. But Elizabeth herself had no preference. She reveled in it all. Wherever she went, her first thought was finding a suitable place to inflict pain. Ilona Jo, once a nursemaid, would later testify that the Countess could neither eat nor drink until she had first witnessed the bloody death of one of her maids. It was as though suffering had become her sustenance, the sight of blood her appetite's only cure. When her husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, died, it seemed to remind Elizabeth of her own mortality. Now, a widow of 40, she became obsessed with staving off the passage of time. Her body, once carefully adorned with finery, now became the focus of her desperation. She traveled far and wide, collecting exotic creams and lotions to preserve her beauty. Hours were spent pinning and styling her hair in elaborate fashions. Yet even these efforts could not shield her from the cruel truth of aging. One day, legend has it, an unfortunate servant girl made the fatal mistake of styling Elizabeth's hair incorrectly. In a fit of rage, the Countess struck the girl with such force that blood spattered across her skin. As she wiped the crimson streaks from her face, Elizabeth paused, her reflection catching her eye. The skin where the blood had touched appeared smoother, firmer, as though the fleeting vitality of youth had returned. A dark idea began to take hold. Convinced she had found a way to reverse the effects of time, Elizabeth devised a ritual both grotesque and horrifying. Summoning Dorka and Fichko, she commanded them to prepare the first of many victims. The terrified maid was stripped and bound, her arms held over a large vat. Elizabeth herself took the blade, slicing it into the girl's arteries with deliberate precision. As blood poured into the vessel, Elizabeth ordered the maid's body to be discarded. Then, in a ritual of macabre decadence, the Countess immersed herself in the still warm blood. To her, it was not just liquid. It was a miraculous elixir, her key to reclaiming her fading beauty. This act became a horrifying routine. Rumors spread throughout the region, whispers of the Blood Countess, whose lust for youth knew no bounds. Villagers began to vanish, and Elizabeth's castle became a place of unspeakable dread. To those who knew her, Elizabeth was no longer just a noblewoman. She was a monster, one who bathed in the lifeblood of innocence, consumed by her fear of growing old and forgotten. Her obsession would eventually lead to her downfall, but by the time justice reached her doorstep, the rivers of her cruelty had already stained history forever. The chosen victim was sent to the cellar, often under the pretense of retrieving wine. It was there, in the cold, shadowed depths, that Fichko, the hunchbacked dwarf and loyal accomplice, awaited with a knife in hand. His task was brutal but straightforward, to overpower and kill the girl swiftly. Once the life had drained from the victim, Elizabeth herself descended into the cellar. Her maidservants followed, carrying the body to the waiting bathtub. The scene that unfolded next was one of macabre ritual. The Countess, her expression calm and calculating, bathed in the still warm blood of her victim, convinced that its crimson touch would restore her fading youth. After her ritual bath, Elizabeth would retreat to her chamber. There, her servants continued their grotesque work. They scraped away the dried blood clinging to her skin. Fichko's role did not end there. He was tasked with disposing of the evidence, dragging the corpse through the labyrinthine network of underground passages that stretched beneath the castle. But Elizabeth's blood rituals were not confined to the tub alone. Sometimes, her craving for cruelty demanded something far more elaborate and horrifying. Among her many devices of torment was a steel cage, specially constructed to amplify the suffering of its prisoner. The cage was ingeniously sinister, too low to stand upright, too narrow to sit comfortably, and lined with sharp metal studs. When Elizabeth's appetite for bloodlust reached its peak, a young girl would be forced into this dreadful contraption. The cage, suspended from the ceiling by chains, could be rocked back and forth. As it swung violently, the victim's body was crushed against the studs, her flesh torn apart in a gruesome symphony of screams and metal. When the cage was not in use, Elizabeth turned to the Iron Virgin, another terrifying instrument of death. This mannequin-like contraption appeared at first to be an artistic sculpture, but its purpose was far darker. Hidden within were blades that emerged from small openings beneath its chest. When a victim was placed within the Iron Virgin, the knives were triggered, plunging mercilessly into her body. These devices were not only tools of death, they were extensions of Elizabeth's insatiable desire for blood and domination. Her rituals grew more elaborate with time, and her notoriety began to reach beyond the walls of Chaktich. When rumors of her crimes began to seep into the surrounding villages, Elizabeth found ways to deflect suspicion. A widow of considerable wealth and influence, she frequently left the castle to travel across Europe. Moravia, the Czech Republic, Austria, and Poland all became temporary havens for the Countess as whispers of her deeds spread. Yet wherever Elizabeth traveled, her dark shadow followed. Young girls began to vanish, just as they had in Chaktich. These disappearances were often dismissed as unfortunate accidents or the work of highwaymen, and no one thought to connect the crimes to the elegant Hungarian aristocrat passing through their lands. But those who found the bodies knew a darker truth. The victims bore wounds too numerous and too cruel to be inflicted by ordinary men. Elizabeth's travels, however, were more than mere escapes. They were opportunities. She used her journeys to seek out new victims and new accomplices, ensuring that her ghastly rituals could continue uninterrupted. Elizabeth remained untouchable for many years, her noble status shielding her from accusations. To the outside world, she was still a widow of stature and grace, a benefactor of the church, and a woman of refined taste. By the time the full extent of her crimes came to light, Elizabeth's name had already become synonymous with horror. Her obsession with youth and beauty had driven her to commit atrocities that would haunt the region for centuries. When the Countess realized that the blood of ordinary villagers had only a limited effect on enhancing her complexion, she turned her attention to young noblewomen from impoverished families. In 1609, she even established an academy, the Gynaeceum, under the pretense of offering education and refinement to these girls. However, when affluent parents began questioning the whereabouts of their daughters, Elizabeth's increasingly absurd explanations began to arouse suspicion. Her usual excuse of a cholera outbreak soon became untenable. Instead, she claimed that some of the girls had died in tragic hunting accidents. But as her mental state deteriorated, so did her ability to maintain discretion. She no longer made an effort to hide the evidence of her crimes. When the castle's cellars could no longer accommodate the growing number of graves, the bodies were hastily buried in shallow pits in the courtyard or discarded into the castle's moat. Starving dogs often unearthed and dragged the corpses back into view. Elizabeth commissioned a special carriage to transport the remains. Corpses were thrown from the carriage windows as it passed through the surrounding countryside, scattering gruesome evidence far and wide. Eventually, Elizabeth's actions became impossible to ignore. A total of 12 complaints were filed with the royal court, and the Hungarian king, Matthias II, was compelled to launch an investigation into the disturbing allegations. In the spring of 1610, György Thurzó, the highest judge in Hungary, launched a covert investigation on behalf of King Matthias II and the Hungarian parliament. Over the course of their work, they interviewed 52 witnesses. Many of them corroborated the horrific rumors of torture, murder, and even cannibalism, although none of the witnesses claimed to have directly observed these acts. A critical breakthrough came from Chaktichi pastors Barosius and Ponikenus, who discovered human remains in tunnels linking the church to the castle. Their report strengthened the case against Elizabeth Bathory. Initially, Thurzó considered sentencing Elizabeth to a life of confinement in a monastery. However, when she began to threaten him with support from her influential pro-Turkish allies, led by Gabriel Bathory, who was rebelling against the Habsburgs, Thurzó realized that more decisive action was necessary. On December 29, 1610, just after Christmas, Count István Thurzó and his men stormed Elizabeth's estate, catching her and her servants completely unprepared. In the courtyard, they presented the mutilated bodies of her victims, each more gruesome than the last. Among the dead was one girl, still alive, who was quickly questioned. With trembling fear, she revealed the identities of her tormentors. A woman named Catalin tore me with tongs, and Lady Widow Nadazdi beat me with her hand. Faced with this undeniable evidence, Elizabeth tried to deflect blame, claiming, "I let them do it because I was afraid of them." But her protests were in vain. Further searches of the castle and its grounds unearthed the remains of about 50 victims, each a silent testament to her sadistic cruelty. Elizabeth was confined to her castle, while her loyal servants, including a dwarf named Jan Ujvari, were taken to Bitcha for interrogation. Accusations of murder, torture, and severe beatings were levied against her, and under pressure, her servants turned on one another, implicating Elizabeth and even the late Anna Darvulia, her sinister mentor. As the weight of the accusations mounted, Elizabeth feared for her life. On July 31st, 1614, she wrote a will, leaving all her possessions to her children, perhaps sensing that the end was near. The clergy, eager to add charges of witchcraft to the proceedings, pushed for testimony under torture to solidify these claims. Pastor Ponikenus even penned a letter urging the witnesses to align their testimonies with such allegations. One of the servants, Fichko, revealed that Elizabeth's cruelty was not a recent development, but had begun during her husband's lifetime, only escalating after she took Anna Darvulia under her wing. Fichko claimed Elizabeth had personally murdered 37 young women, while other servants estimated her victims numbered between 36 and 50. However, a registry supposedly maintained by Bathory herself suggested a far more horrifying figure, up to 650 victims. Throughout the ordeal, Elizabeth never once admitted to her crimes. She continued to write letters to King Matthias II, desperately pleading for an acquittal. In response, the king ordered a re-examination of the case, and in July and December of 1611, additional testimonies from 336 witnesses were added to the case files. On January 7, 1611, after all the evidence had been reviewed, a court of 14 judges delivered their verdict. Elizabeth was found guilty of her heinous crimes, and her accomplices were charged with sorcery, vampirism, and participating in pagan rituals. As for the other servants, their fates were far more grim. They were sentenced to execution, a fitting end to their twisted roles in one of history's most notorious chapters. Fichko was beheaded and his body publicly burned due to his old age. 2 weeks later, on January 24th, Busorka of Myjava, another accomplice, was burned alive without even being questioned. Elizabeth herself was spared execution due to her noble status. Instead, she was confined to a solitary room within her castle, with only a small opening to receive food. For 3 years, the widowed Countess protested the court's verdict, writing letters that revealed her lack of remorse. On August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth was found dead on the floor of one of her chambers under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts suggest she was poisoned, while others claim she succumbed to starvation after being sealed within a tower. Legends describe her body in a horrifying state, with bite marks on her forearms and blood covering the ground around her. She was buried 3 months later, on November 25th, 1614, in the crypt of the church in Countess. However, local residents demanded her body be removed, and in 1617, she was reburied in Nagyexid, in northeastern Hungary. When the family crypt was opened in 1995, her remains were not found, fueling rumors and conspiracy theories. Some historians speculate that her grave may be located in a cemetery in Budapest, but no evidence has been found to confirm this claim. Some believe she escaped her confinement and lived out her days in secret, adding an air of mystery to the dark legacy of the Blood Countess.